Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I'm really going to have to improve my Spanish. It's a beautiful language, and you're going to have to enjoy me, I think, in English at the moment. So I hope my translation comes through well in Spanish, and I shall remember to speak more slowly than I normally do in my Irish fast pace. It's a real joy. I'd like to thank Professor Maria Sid for this outstanding opportunity to be here, and the biannual legacy of the Anchor Workshop and the outstanding job she has done for Barcelona. We've been excited for 2 years, and now I blink and you're here, and it's really lovely to be in Barcelona for the first time. I'm Dr. Allyson Egan, and I'm a consultant nephrologist. I work in Trinity Health Kidney Centre in Dublin in Ireland. Pretty like everybody here, passionate about vasculitis and what that means for the lived experience. I'm very delighted to be asked by Joyce to come and talk about clinical trials, because I think this is pivotal in the management, but also for your lifestyle, what it means for treatment. I would like to say it's a pleasure to see so many of the vasculitis societies here today who have been so formative in giving us the research agendas for what really matters. When I look out also at Julie and Peter and Zoe, we know what's important in clinical trials. And Joe has really set the scene for this, because steroid sparing is a really important question. But their management and having an outcome where vasculitis is quiet, that it's a friend we live with but doesn't define us, is a real focus and goal going forward. So what is a clinical trial? Like everything else about vasculitis, you were probably leading your life. You probably weren't reading medical books. It wasn't something that was prescribed that you thought you might need to know. What does a clinical trial mean? So along the journey, it's something that I'm sure in your own hospitals has become a focal point. But we're going to just put a structure on that conversation, think about what the definitions are, what does that mean for vasculitis, how could you get involved, and what is the importance of clinical trial. And at the end, what I'd really love to do is to hear some of your own experiences about if you've been members of the clinical trial groups. So understanding clinical trials, it was very helpful. Joyce gave me 3 questions, so I have addressed 3 questions. The first was, what are clinical trials? The second question is, why are they important? And third is, how can patients participate with that? And in that, I thought what was really important to address was, what are their definitions? What do we aim to achieve within that? How do we involve, how do we have engagement, enrollment, and recruitment into clinical trials? What are the advantages? What do we often intervene with? And a lot of the time, it'll be about therapeutics, but it's much broader than that, and clinical trials can impact all of your clinical management. And then finally is like, what are the outcomes? What does that mean to have been through a clinical trial? So I was looking for a very good definition, and I'm going to quote 2 organizations for you. One is NIH in the States, and the other is the World Health Organization. If we look at the definition from NIH, they describe a clinical trial as a research study in which one or more human subjects are assigned to have one or more interventions. That may be that you have the treatment as a control or a placebo, and then we evaluate the intervention on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. It sounds it's quite important, because it does show that sometimes in clinical studies, some patients have placebos, sometimes people have the interventional arms, and that it's prospective, that you know ahead of the time in a clinical trial that you're assigned. It's not retrospective, it's prospective. So if we look at another definition from NIH, this is from the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases. And they describe a clinical trial as medical research studies in which people participate as volunteers. They help researchers better understand the normal biological processes, learn more about diseases and conditions, and develop new treatments and medication. It's very much about helping us to understand, both from a biological, mechanistic, but also from a therapeutic and lived experience, understanding vasculitis. So this is a graphic, an infographic, which I think it looks quite small up there now, but it's quite helpful, I think, which was from NIH. And one of the 2 sides of this that I really wanted to focus on is how good are the various types of studies that we do at showcasing cause and effect in vasculitis. And if you look at those that have most impact or most efficacious, it is in clinical trials. So there's a very high impact of research from the results that come through clinical trials. What it really practically means is that every person has a voice. Your outcome, what you experienced, the response that you had to various therapeutics is actually both on an individual, a national and a global scale is collected in data that we understand going forward. It sets the paradigm for both recommendations and guidelines going forward. So that information and that knowledge that we know from your lived experience of vasculitis helps to guide and shape our practices and recommendations going forward. If we look, there are 4 different steps to 4 different phases of different clinical trials. The first one is where you take a small group of patients and can evaluate safe dosage and identify side effects. Phase 2 is where it's found to be safe, but it is applied in larger numbers of the population. Phase 3 can be conducted in larger populations, different regions and countries. And it's the step maybe perhaps before a new treatment is approved. And stage 4 takes place after country approval, national approval, and there's a need for further testing in wider populations. So the definition for a clinical trial, if we look at the World Health Organization, it describes that clinical trials are a type of research that studies new tests and treatments and evaluates their effect in the human health outcomes. Patients volunteer to take part in clinical trials to test medical interventions, and that can include drugs, cells and biological products, surgical procedures, devices, behavioral and preventative care. And clinical trials are carefully designed, reviewed and completed and need to be approved before they start. They are open to patients and people of all ages can take part in clinical trials, including children. We very much have in UKVAS in the United Kingdom and Ireland, we have a very strong both adult and patient participation. Louise Onnie is our paediatrician and a real advocate for the necessity of clinical trials in paediatrics as well as in adults. So what happens in a clinical trial? Well, first of all, who are the key people that you would be very much involved with, and how would you know or wish to get further information? Well, very much your medical team who are looking after you. A lot of the centres that you'll be looking at, I know Professor Sid will be very involved and leads in several clinical trials. So the centres that you're in will be leading on clinical trials in therapeutics, in outcomes about medications, particularly for your vasculitis. As Joe has mentioned, it's very much a multidisciplinary team with specialist nurses, multidisciplinary members of the team, such as psychologists who also impact. There'll be the trial coordinators who'll be liaising very closely about the time points for review, and the research teams who'll be gathering the data and putting together some of the outcomes. So what would that look like? Well, this is quite a busy slide, but really what it explains is that research staff would explain what the trial or study is about, answer questions, gather more information. Once you'd agree to participate, it would mean that you'd sign an informed consent indicating your understanding and what you would expect. Then there's a screening process to see, do you match? Does it match you in terms of what your diagnosis, what your medical history is? Does that match with the study that's underway? Then if it is accepted to go ahead, then you get your first scheduled visit called the baseline visit, and there's cognitive and physical tests. After that, then the trial testing and intervention, you're randomly assigned to the treatment or the control group. The treatment group will get the intervention being tested, the control group will not. Then you follow trial procedures. You may visit the research site at regular scheduled time visits for assessment, and then you continue to see your regular physicians for the usual healthcare throughout the study. It's part of your ongoing management within your centre. So what happens when the clinical study ends? Well, once it ends, the researchers analyse the data to determine what the findings mean and to plan the next steps. As a participant, you'll be provided with information before the study starts, how long it will last, and and whether you will continue to receive treatment after the trial ends, if that's applicable, and how the results of the research will be shared. So what does that mean for a vasculitis patient? They're the guidance on what is a clinical trial, the understanding of the pathway involved. If we think about it, you will have had really excellent presentations way before me today on the vasculitis patient journey. So where the questions about clinical trials would come in is if we I don't think I quite managed, didn't expect to have done that, but fantastic today. If we start with signs and symptoms, you'd have had a medical review to assess whether vasculitis, investigations to confirm your diagnosis, and then when the management options and plans are underway, that's where we consider whether you would have engagement in clinical trial. And of course that could happen then at the beginning of your diagnosis or further down as new trials come online, or whether the vasculitis needs further treatment. Then there'll be engagement in clinical consideration and engagement in clinical trial and review throughout the process. So they're really the steps for in clinical trials. So if we look at vasculitis, it is largely defined, this classification is an iconic slide. I think nearly every doctor who's spoken of vasculitis has presented this at a meeting. It shows that vasculitis is often either in the small vessels, the medium vessels, or the large vessels. Now, it's really iconic. Some people talk about the tube map, some people talk about Picasso, and then there is this diagram, which is iconic. But it also helps us to define how we stratify treatment for various categories of vasculitis. So if you have large vessel vasculitis, you have a certain treatment pathway. And then if you have small vessel, you may have different treatment options. But what is the same throughout, and this paper, Professor Kitching is in the audience, who wrote this led an international team writing this paper. What's clear is we talk about the early phase as induction, and then we talk about after that as maintenance therapy. And they are the phases of treatment. And clinical trials can be conducted for the early induction phase, or they can be later during the maintenance phase. And it's really important that we have as much information on those phases of vasculitis, because this is a lifetime journey. We wrote this paper. Now, this is the really good news. This is the exciting. This is a lot of people's lifetime work. I see Dr. Merkel here in the audience. What this is, we wrote a trial map with the UVAS group and with Professor Sid. So if we look at the early phase of induction and then maintenance treatment, all those names and different highlights are the clinical trials that have been conducted and are guiding the clinical therapy in small vessel vasculitis. And we could do the same for large vessel and medium vessel. And so it's incredibly important that we have this information, because it guides the sort of pathways that you will have in your treatment about the medications and understanding what was the response in clinical trial. For example, what does a clinical trial look like? This was the PEXIVAS trial design. We won't go into it in detail, but what it does show is you start off with a certain number of participants. It's for a set period of time. You're allocated to different arms of the trial, and then it comes to a conclusion, and the reports come through with recommendations. And so the vasculitis is really a showcase in rare disease for how management and clinical trials are conducted. This is really down to the very successful vasculitis networks that are underway around the globe. We will see the Vasculitis Clinical Research Consortium, UVAS, and these have been pivotal in bringing vasculitis patients together and instrumental in having centres that conduct clinical trials. So what are the important multifactorial benefits? If we looked at it, it does provide access to interventions such as therapeutics. If we look at the connectivity and monitoring, there's a very close relationship with the healthcare team within your centre. You have regular assessments and to see your response to therapy. You have that individual and global voice, both your experience with the medication and also wherever you are in the world that's involved in the clinical trial participating, is to see the response to that. It gives guidance and recommendations and guidelines. This is really important. We know that across Europe and across the States, we regularly update the recommendations for vasculitis management, and clinical trial outcomes and results are incorporated into the body of work that guide that. It's very important in the strategic development and research agenda, because there are many questions that are answered that allow us to go on and propose what is the next research. As those clinical trials for induction and maintenance have come, they've answered a question, and that then goes on and guides us. What does that lead us to in our next clinical question? So it gives us a very strong research strategic development plan. It also is really important for education. Here we are. This is a pivotal moment which shows how important it is, both national and international levels, what can be learned from education and what comes from clinical trials, to be able to tell us that. What works, what doesn't work, when will it work, when will it not? And for you to be truly informed and empowered about where you are with vasculitis in your life. Because the more control you have of that, the more likely you are to have the life that you want. That it's living with vasculitis, not defined by it. And clinical trial outcomes give us the result of that. It trains our juniors staff, that brings on experts coming in the future, and the word that is assigned, I think, is empowerment. So, right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you how you can participate. You can participate by connecting with your healthcare professional in your hospital. They will usually have a research portfolio that includes clinical trials. Then they will show you the portfolio that may be relevant to you and assessment for participation. It also extends to the education, to committee participation in the development of the trials, on the papers, their patient groups for reporting and for strategies going forward. It's also about conference participation, reporting back the outcomes, and volunteers, which we wouldn't be here without. So, how can you find out more? Well, 2 clinical sites that are really very helpful. There's Clinical Research Trials at NIH, and also if you'd like to have a look at clinicaltrials.gov, maybe way too much, but just for you to know, this is hot off the press from today. If you look at clinicaltrials.gov, this is the number of clinical trials that they're reporting globally around the world, not just with vasculitis, but beyond. And it's important because this is what's going to help us in our strategies to understand therapeutics and outcomes that will help us going forward. Now that we know it's very helpful in connectivity and management strategies, I wonder if there's anybody in the audience who's been in a clinical trial who would like to give us an update on that. Because it's very nice to hear me, but really I'm not the most important person. The most important people are you and your experiences, and maybe perhaps how you would like to tell each other, perhaps if one of you has been in a clinical trial. The conference is really important. We're seeing the results of the Advocate trial. We're going to be seeing the results of the Mandara trial. So it's really important topic coming through in the conference, the results when the trials read out and they are delivered, and it has huge impact for patients going forward. So please do share your stories. Maria will tell me them in Spanish. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes. Just to declare my interest, that I sit on both sides of the fence. I've worked in clinical trials and I'm a patient. 2 observations, and I think something that patients need to be reassured about, is whether they get to have an answer about the extra tests or the changes in their medication or the changes, but because I know that most trials are double-blinded, so they don't know what is on. And that, I've always found, has been a discomfort for the patient. They don't actually know what they're getting. I understand why, but how do you address that to encourage patients into it? And the other observation is that for patients who are well enough and now on maintenance, ready to travel, if you participate in a clinical trial, insurance companies are very reluctant to cover you for any changes in your condition because of the clinical trial. And I've been told that only phase 3 and phase 4 would be covered, which kind of precludes participating in early stage trials. And I do think that sort of clinicians and the industry needs to recognise that in order to encourage well patients to participate.
Thank you very much. I think they're great questions. I think the first question I think is incredibly important. It really focuses that it's very important to consider what is the right trial for the condition you're in. Sometimes that's a therapeutic trial, sometimes it's more an observational trial. So I think not every trial will be suitable for every patient, and I think first of all, and that's what's really important about that meeting, and we as healthcare professionals, we really love this, is looking at what are the portfolio of clinical trials that may suit a patient at that particular time. The next thing I would say is often with clinical studies, there's such important questions to answer. Some of them are add-on therapy to existing treatments. So that's another important question. For many of them, that you have your existing treatment, but you may get an add-on drug in addition. I think it's really important that we are able to embrace new strategies, that including steroid minimization, and we take the opportunities with medications. We understand the biology so much better now. Many of the medications are much more targeted at biological systems. And I think we've had such great responses in the outcomes of clinical trials that it really does help if patients are suitable. But that's it, I totally agree, is an individual decision at that time. But I think it's important to do. And looking at, for the placebo arm is always considered whether that would be suitable for that patient or not at that time. So it's a really important question and is addressed. But it's really worth looking at the portfolio of trials that could add to your current therapy if you were to receive the drug. I think the other question is really important. There are different variations around the world how we pay for our healthcare, and I think it's really important that as much as possible that patients are able to receive, treatment as they can. I think and I think not just for clinical trials, I think how much travel, how much visit times. So I think the coordinated role, and we've worked very hard on this. I know around the globe in the United Kingdom and Ireland, we've really worked at streamlining hospital visits, at seeing if we can do alternating telecalls, if we can do it that we do multiple visits at the same time. And I think clinical trials, while they're very much governed by the pattern of the trial, have also tried to identify that. And I think the equity of access is a really important question for us always to take forward.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for your very interesting talk. Can I just say, as a patient from the UK, I've been part of designing the trial from the point of view of the patient. And one of the things that we looked into was very much how to get the patients to the various trial centres.
Yes.
When it would be possible for them to pick up the drug. It was very important that they had contact with the physicians conducting the trial as and when they needed it, if it was outside the time
Yes.
they allotted, maybe 3 months to picking
Yes.
up.
Yes.
So we were very conscious that patients mustn't feel sort of abandoned during the time
intervals
between visits.
Yes.
And it was pulling all of our different thoughts. We feel that we came up with something that would be suitable to everybody. I think as well, the other thing, we talk about placebo and the disappointment perhaps if you've put your name forward to be on a trial, you end up with the placebo. But I think you just have to understand and appreciate that both arms of the trial are necessary, and you just have to be happy with the one that you've been allotted to.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I think it's really important, and I think it's very important that that your input is there, is that very much in the clinical design phase, in the writing phase, is that there is patient partnerships and involvement throughout that. And you're absolutely right, the logistics and access are two key issues, and something that we think about not only in the clinical trial setting but also in the day-to-day for all patients, and they're vital in access. That's why people are very loyal, I think, to a lot of their services who care passionately about that. Thank you.
Hi, it's Rob here. Just wish to raise with the group too, sometimes a placebo is an active drug. It's not like you're getting a sugar tablet. So sometimes you've got an existing drug that's out there and we know how it works. We may call that a placebo, so we're comparing the new drug to it.
Yes.
So it's not like you're getting no treatment. You may
Thank
just
you.
not getting the latest or the test drug.
Yes, thank you for sharing. Indeed, that it's very important. The placebo is very helpful, and it is very helpful both in concept and what it represents. And each trial is different. So, indeed, maybe I think the definitions make that seem very bland. So, I'm glad we've really highlighted that in the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention. We hope to see you in clinical trials. Thank you very much.